Houston, Texas, oil capital of America, home of some of the world's greatest corporations. But a century ago, Houston was an isolated backwater. It was here that Howard Hughes Jr. was born on Christmas Eve, 1905. Unlike Juan Tripp's banker father and respectable upbringing, Hughes' heredity was considerably more colorful.
His father was a wildcatter in the oil fields of Texas, and if you stood in his way to an oil claim, he'd shoot your hat off. He was a rough outlaw character.
Howard Hughes Sr., known to most as Big Howard, drifted for more than 30 years in Texas, scraping by from one failed scheme to the next. Scraping by until he had a brainstorm that would revolutionize the oil business. At the turn of the century, gushers of oil were flowing from the sandy Texas plains in the biggest oil boom in history. In 1908, Big Howard invented a drill that could penetrate the thick rock beneath the sandy Texas soil.
Once it was patented, it became the staple for all drilling operations all over the world.
Big Howard was suddenly tremendously wealthy. He packed Little Howard off to the finest East Coast boarding schools.
As a spoilt rich boy, he simply felt the world was his oyster, that he could do exactly what he wanted. And he did, in fact, indulge himself at every level and became intensely, as time went on, self-obsessed.
In 1920, Hughes, against the wishes of his parents, took flying lessons from a Texas crop duster and, like Juan Tripp, fell in love with airplanes.
Well, Howard Hughes started in aviation because, like Tripp and everybody else, he was fascinated by airplanes. He liked speed. He liked to do better than anyone else.
In 1923, Hughes' life took a dramatic turn. His mother died in the fall, and less than a year later, in 1924, Big Howard followed. Barely 19, Little Howard was suddenly a millionaire.
He inherited $1 million, which in those days is worth 50 or 60 million, at least today. So he got off to a very good start.
Tall, handsome, and suddenly fabulously rich, no one called Hughes Little Howard anymore. In 1925, Hughes went to Hollywood. A striking young man with money to burn, he quickly became immensely popular in the film world.
Howard Hughes seemed to have courted notoriety all his life. He was deeply involved in fame and fortune, celebrity, always with a new film star, some of whom he married, most of whom he dropped.
He produced numerous pictures, financed an Oscar award-winning comedy in 1927, and in 1930 combined his two loves and directed one of the most successful aviation movies of all time, Hell's Angels. He'd made himself the undisputed master of aviation movies. Now he was ready to tackle the real thing. Hughes began to race planes competitively. In September 1935, he set a record of 352 miles per hour. The next year, he purchased a high-powered Northrop Gamma and hired an elite group of engineers to convert it into an even faster aircraft.
He would dabble in things. He had tremendous wealth that he could use to carry out some of his ideas, and some of them were absolutely brilliant.
3 years later, Hughes entered the record books again, this time flying a Lockheed 14 across America in record time.
Howard Hughes, millionaire sportsman and aviator, brings his famous Lockheed into New York from Glendale, California, for another new flying record. This time, he's cut the flying time from coast to coast for transport-type planes to 10 1/2 hours. A most amazing young man.
Less than a decade after Lindbergh, a new dashing young aviator was grabbing headlines.
He became a national hero. He was another Lindbergh. He was an idol.
But even the headlines, crowds, and ticker tape parades wouldn't satisfy Hughes. He longed for something more.
But Howard Hughes wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted a fleet of airplanes. He wanted to own the air.
Just as his millions had bought his way into Hollywood and the record books, Hughes used his fortune to buy his way into the airline business. In 1939, he bought a controlling interest in TWA. Over at Pan Am, Juan Trippe wasn't overly concerned with TWA's new chief. TWA was a domestic airline that flew land-based planes like the workhorse DC-3. Hughes and TWA were no match for Pan Am's ocean-going Clippers. Not long after Hughes took over TWA, he began changing the conservative airline into a company more fitting his personal style. Much to his business manager's chagrin, he courted his movie business friends. Courtesy limousines awaited stars at the airport, and the biggest stars always traveled free of charge. With Hughes at the helm, TWA quickly became the movie stars airline.
He took a whole party of movie stars to New York on one occasion. Cary Grant took the controls, which was completely against FAA regulations, but he didn't care about things like that. Generally speaking, it was used as a party boat. It was like having a private yacht, a NASA's yacht or something. It was a private boat.
With Hughes in control, TWA was more than just an airline. It was Hughes' personal plaything. But even owning the movie stars airline wasn't enough for the irrepressible Hughes. He didn't just want to own the #1 domestic airline. He wanted to build TWA into a worldwide empire, the world's greatest international airline. But standing square in his way was Juan Trippe's Pan Am. The battle for the skies